Good morning. We are going to start off with a quick 4-minute video to just kind of catch up, and then we will continue with, we have 3 sections left. We have 21.8, 21.9, and 2110. So we have control of respiration, the effects of altitude and exercise on respiration, and then we'll go through a couple of diseases as well.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy, and breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the 2 bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. 1 oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells, into the plasma, and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
That is a quick 4-minute summary of like the last 2 hours of lecture that we've covered in the past week. So we're going to move on to the neural mechanisms that are going to that control respiration. So what sets our initial rate and depth of breathing, and then how is that affected by exercise and altitude? There are three respiratory centers that are going to control ventilation rate and depth. 2 of them are in the medulla and 1 is in the pons. The ventral respiratory group is going to be the center that, we'll come back to dorsal, but the ventral respiratory group is going to be the center that sets the normal respiratory rate and rhythm. Okay, so it is the rhythm generating and integrative center. It controls rate by sending action potentials through inspiratory neurons. So it sends an action potential and then another one. So for about 2 seconds, it sends stimulatory action potentials. And it would continue at this rate of about 1 every 2 seconds. And if you calculate that out, that would be about 30 respirations per minute. We, as it says in the slide above, our normal respiratory rate and rhythm is between 12 and 15. And that's because instead of every 2 seconds, these expiratory neurons are going to inhibit action potentials for the next 3 seconds. So we have 2 seconds of inhalation where you're breathing in, muscles contracting, expanding that thoracic volume, bringing air in. And then these neurons, the inspiratory neurons, are inhibited by expiratory neurons that are going to allow for a 3-second exhale period. So we have inspiratory neurons setting action potentials for 2 seconds, expiratory neurons inhibiting the inspiratory neurons so that we can exhale, expire air for about 3 seconds. So that ventral respiratory center is going to set this initial rate and rhythm. The rate is 12 to 15 breaths per minute, and the rhythm is a 2-second inspiratory phase followed by a 3-second expiratory phase. The dorsal respiratory group is going to receive information from peripheral stretch receptors. These are going to be from like proprioceptors as well as chemoreceptors. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to exercise. And then we have our third center, the pontine respiratory center in the pons. The pontine respiratory center is going to fine-tune these breathing rhythms so they're not irregular, so that we have a smooth inspiratory phase and a smooth expiratory phase. So it is going to fine-tune these breathing rhythms during vocalization, sleep, and exercise. The end product is a smooth transition, so just smooth inhale, smooth exhale. This is a graphic of those 3 centers. Again, we have the ventral respiratory group in the medulla that is going to set that normal rate and rhythm. We have the dorsal respiratory group that is going to come more into play when we have things like exercise. And we'll talk about why we need a separate mechanism of input in just a minute. And then the pontine respiratory center in the pons is going to create a nice smooth inspiratory phase and expiratory phase that's coordinated to match our needs when we sleep, when we vocalize, when we have exercise, when we perform exercise. The nerve that innervates the diaphragm is called the phrenic nerve, and it's the diaphragm and the external intercostals that are innervated under normal breathing. This is just a normal tidal volume to contract. In the diaphragm goes down, increasing thoracic volume, and air is inspired. So 3 centers with 3 different roles. But when we're talking about breathing, we talk about rate and depth. So rate is how fast we can go from inspiration to expiration, inspiration, expiration. And then depth is looking into going into that inspiratory reserve volume. As I mentioned, we have inspiratory neurons that are going to send action potentials. This will result in a 2-second inspiratory phase. And then we have 3 seconds off because of those inhibitory neurons. In order to increase the depth, the number of action potentials sent during that 2-second inspiratory phase would be greater. And this greater number of action potentials increases the number of motor units that are excited, stimulated, and this will cause more muscle fibers to contract, further depressing the diaphragm, and the external intercostals will be more active, and this will further increase the thoracic cavity and increase the depth of inspiration. So the number of action potentials dictates how many motor units are activated, which then results in the depth of respiration. Rate is determined by how long a center is active. If we need to increase respiratory rate, we can decrease this phase. So inspire for 2 seconds, expire for, we don't inhibit as long, and then we'll get a 2 second. So then if that would increase it from 12 to 15. And then you can shorten those phases even more to get up to like 20 respirations per minute, which is where we are usually for about exercise. Okay. The respiratory centers are affected by chemical factors, higher brain centers, pulmonary irritant reflexes, and the inflation reflex. For chemical factors, you need to be able to identify which factor is the strongest. So which one is going to be the dominating factor, especially under resting conditions, and that is going to be PCO2. When people look at the factors, PO2, PCO2, and pH, the initial reaction is oxygen, because of course we need oxygen. We need oxygen for our metabolism, we need oxygen for our brain. But with oxygen, we have that hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. And at rest, we're at 75% reserve. So we have this tremendous reserve. And even at exercise, we usually have a 50 to 60% reserve. So because we store so much oxygen on hemoglobin, the oxygen levels stay pretty consistent. So it's not going to be the driving factor. PCO2, because it gets converted to bicarbonate, that's its main mechanism. It can diffuse in plasma, it can get carried on hemoglobin. It is going to be the driving factor. And in addition, we haven't gone there yet, but when we get to acid base, it will be more clear as to how and why ventilation is controlled by CO2, partial pressure of CO2. pH can act independently of CO2 and oxygen. So chemical factors are the most important of all factors affecting depth and rate of inspiration. We're going to talk a little bit about cortical control of voluntary ventilation. So I can voluntarily take a deep breath and I can voluntarily hyperventilate, but it's always going to be overcome by chemical factors. I can try and hold my breath for like an hour. It's not going to work. The chemical factors are going to override whatever voluntary mechanism I'm attempting. There are chemoreceptors that are central, located in the brain stem. And then there are peripheral chemoreceptors located in the aortic arch and carotid arteries. I'm going to skip ahead a sec. They are, so for the chemoreceptors located in the aortic arch, they're here in the aortic bodies. And then the carotid body is where the common carotid bifurcates, so it forks, takes two paths, an external and an internal, and that's where these carotid bodies are located. So very good locations. They receive a lot of blood flow, and they're going to monitor the oxygen, carbon dioxide, pH levels that are going to be received into that cardiac circulation, because those come off of the aorta. Those bronchial arteries also come off of the aorta, and then as well as the systemic arterial system initiates here. And then we have a duplication because the carotid arteries are going to lead to the brain, which of course we know needs a lot of oxygen. Okay, so we talked about chemoreceptors. So why is carbon dioxide such an effective agent? And the reason why is, so our cells are metabolically active, they produce carbon dioxide. Your plasma has water, right? And so carbon dioxide and water combine to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, then that's it, that H2CO3 in the reaction, it's been written before. Carbonic acid dissociates, releasing hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. These hydrogen ions are acidic, and when we have chemoreceptors, they are free nerve endings, and they get stimulated by those hydrogen ions and send action potentials to the central nervous system. Increase in hydrogen ions stimulates the chemoreceptors, which will increase the depth and rate of breathing to lower PCO2 and in the process lowering pH. We'll learn more about that with acid base. So if we get an increase in partial pressure of CO2, we're going to get a decrease in pH, so in the extracellular fluid. And these hydrogen ions, they get trapped on that side of in the extracellular fluid because they actually have to be transported across. So it's a good signal because it doesn't dissipate right away. So increase in CO2, we're going to get an increase in hydrogen ions stimulating chemoreceptors, and then those are going to travel to those medullary respiratory centers, the ventral and the dorsal, and that will activate the respiratory muscle, increase ventilation, exhale carbon dioxide. We have that negative homeostasis where we return PCO2 and pH to normal. So CO2 is the main regulator. We have PO2 and pH remaining. PO2 normally has a very slight effect on ventilation because we have such a large reservoir of oxygen bound to hemoglobin. It's going to require a substantial drop in arterial PO2 to stimulate increased ventilation. So we have to substantially drop off on that oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. pH can modify respiratory rate and rhythm even if CO2 and O2 levels are normal. And this is important because decreased pH may reflect CO2 retention, but also accumulation of lactic acid during things like exercise and ketone bodies, which occurs sometimes in uncontrolled diabetes. pH is an increase in hydrogen ions, and it will drive ventilation rates to reestablish that acid-base balance. So again, we're going to talk more about acid-base balance and pH and even in the role of CO2 in that in about 2 weeks. We're coming up on it. For respiratory system, you do need to understand that PCO2 is the main driver of altering respiratory rate and depth, followed by pH because it can act independently of PCO2 and O2, and then PO2 under normal conditions rarely comes into play with affecting ventilation rate. Summary of chemical factors. Rising CO2 levels are the most powerful respiratory stimulant. They dissociate into hydrogen ions, and that will affect the chemoreceptors. Changes in arterial pH can also act indirectly through peripheral chemoreceptors, and then normally blood O2 doesn't play much of a factor. Like with most things, we usually have that slide, and it says influence of higher brain centers, that your brain will play a role, and we kind of stop it there because we had the brain in 1141, but it's just a reminder that their higher brain centers can affect breathing rate and depth. So the hypothalamus is in kind of a unique position, and that we have our limbic system, which is involved in emotions, and its axons are going to run, through the hypothalamus. And so when we have a lot of activation of the limbic system, those neurons become very active, and the axons become actually somewhat leaky and irritate the hypothalamus. This is why when people get upset, their stomachs actually physically get upset, and it's because it's a physiological link between the neurons of the limbic system running through the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus can play a role, as well as the cerebral motor cortex. We can, as I mentioned, we can control our breathing to some extent. Those chemical controls will override, and they'll override pretty quickly because we need to have constant, consistent oxygen availability and CO2 removal. But we are able to regulate, hold our breath, take deep breaths, hyperventilate intentionally, with those cortical controls for a short period of time. Then we're going to move on to the pulmonary irritant reflexes and then the stretch reflex. These are essentially protective reflexes. There are receptors in the bronchioles, especially at that carina, which is above it. It's where the trachea bifurcates, forks into the right and left main bronchi. excuse me. See, pulmonary irritant reflex. Receptors are going to respond to things like dust, accumulated mucus, and this is going to trigger either a cough or a sneeze. The inflation reflex involves, and you don't need to remember that it's the Herring-Brewer reflex. The inflation reflex, much easier to identify with its function. There are stretch receptors in the pleura and the airways, and these will send inhibitory centers to the medulla. If you think about it, your alveoli, they have very thin membrane. They do have some elastic fibers, but they don't have a contractile mechanism, so they can only inflate, and we need to protect them from inflating so much that they burst. So this inflation reflex it takes signals from above that, and it is going to maintain air inflation to a level, it's going to constrict that to a level that it's not going to overinflate and damage the alveoli. So this pulmonary irritant reflex as well as the inflation reflex are both protective mechanisms. This is a summary of that we have respiratory centers. The main one is the ventral one in the medulla. It will get input through the dorsal one when we'll talk about with exercise. It's not as well identified, but they think that's the main role, as well as the pontine center that smooths inspiration and expiratory phases. There are two protective reflexes, the stretch receptors and then the irritant receptors. So those protective reflexes. There is input from the cerebral cortex that can control the diaphragm and give voluntary control over breathing. The main control is going to be peripheral chemoreceptors with CO2, definitely at the top of the hierarchy. And then we'll talk about these receptors in muscles and joints that send information to that dorsal respiratory center to influence breathing rate and depth. So we're going to move on to the effects of exercise and altitude on respiration. During exercise, adjustments must be made. We need to increase ventilation, so we increase ventilation rate as well as tidal volume, and the minute ventilation increases 10 to 20 fold. So we can get up to about 200 liters of air passing through our respiratory passages in a minute. So that's a lot. This level of the max ventilation does take training. It's not an inherent ability, but we do get better at being more effective with inspiration and exhalation with training, athletic training. PCO2, PO2, and pH remain relatively constant during exercise because we have this increase in ventilation rate. We don't wait for a giant increase in CO2 in order to stimulate ventilation rate, which is why scientists started looking for a different mechanism. And that's going to be feedback into that dorsal respiratory center in the medulla. So increase in ventilation during exercise is due to three factors. One is the physiological stimuli. So it's anticipating an exercise even before you start walking or running, your ventilation rate starts to increase. Also, there is the motor activation of skeletal muscle. And when we start exercising, the proprioceptors, which is a pretty large group of receptors, we have them in muscles, we have them in tendons, and we have a set of about 4 of them in joints. So it's a pretty extensive system. Proprioceptors will send messages, signals, action impulse, action potentials to that dorsal respiratory center. And then that dorsal respiratory center is going to affect rate and depth. With high altitude, there are acute effects and then chronic effects. Normally, atmospheric pressure is sufficient to maintain high levels of hemoglobin saturation up to about 5,000 feet. Past 5,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure declines and PO2 levels are lower. And the further up you go, the worse it gets. So at altitude, atmospheric pressure and PO2 levels are lower. Acutely, this results in acute mountain sickness. Symptoms are headaches, shortness of breath, nausea, and dizziness. The adaptations are going to be an increase in minute ventilation acutely, and then more long-term are going to be the kidneys accelerating production of red blood cells through the production of erythropoietin. Chemoreceptors, this is also, I don't know, it's kind of like days, not weeks or months, but it's not minutes either. But the chemoreceptors become more responsive to PCO2 when PO2 declines. And this is because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going to decrease as well. And so the if your chemoreceptors are set to 45, so normally we're like 40 in the systemic and 45 at the tissues. If it's set to that difference and then our partial pressure drops to 38, it's a difference now of 7. So it's going to reset to about 43. So it just adjusts. You don't need to know the altitude numbers, but it's going to become more responsive. We do get that increase in minute ventilation to try and increase oxygen saturation, and then the kidneys. Moving on to diseases. Several of you actually selected chronic obstructive pulmonary disease as your respiratory disease for extra credit. A couple of you picked asthma, and then a few of you got more creative. So again, it was very much fun to read your extra credit discussions. I will also say, I'm going to remind a few of you that in order to receive the full 5 points, you need your 3 facts, your source, and then you need to comment on somebody else's discussion. And I kind of leave those comments up to you as long as they're nice and kind. I'm okay with that. The discussion forum has been reopened for a few days to allow some of you to make comments on someone else's forum if you have not done so already. We're going to talk about, we'll start with we'll start with chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. We're going to look at the differences between emphysema and chronic bronchitis. By far, the commonality between most of the patients is that they have a history of smoking. And I think it was this class, I get the 2 discussion forums a little confused, but I conflate them. And there was the comment of a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. And that just made me crack up because I have memories of that as well. Okay, so the history of smoking is going to be a big factor. When we get to asthma, we're going to look at a little bit more along the line of pollutants. And with chronic bronchitis, it's more common in individuals who live in a high pollutant environment as well, such as inner city or near a factory, something like that. Okay. Dyspnea is defined as difficult or labored breathing. It's being essentially short of breath, and it results in coughing, pulmonary infection, and hypoventilation due to different pathways. This is a nice diagram that talks about the pathways of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. With chronic bronchitis, its stimulus is going to be things more like air pollution, where we get chronic bronchial irritation, inflammation. This is going to cause excessive mucus production in an attempt to trap and then expel those irritants. It leads to airway obstruction, hypoventilation, and eventually respiratory failure if it were to get severe enough. Smoking contains a lot of irritants and pollutants and carcinogenics, which we'll get to when we get to lung cancer. This causes a breakdown of elastin and connective tissue. I also was impressed, someone else brought this up, that this is like 1% of COPD and it's a genetic factor. So that was impressive. You guys are on this, by the way. It's fun to read those discussions. I'm still in the process of grading, so that hasn't showed up yet, but it will today, tomorrow, close, soon. But anyway, the breakdown of elastin, we lose elasticity in the lung tissue, as well as the destruction of alveolar walls, which is going to decrease that alveolar surface area. Normally, alveolar surface area is way sufficient for gas exchange, but in cases like emphysema, where we destroy the alveolar walls are destroyed and they kind of just become an empty sac, then gas diffusion can't occur in that form of just disconnected alveoli. And in fact, it actually ends up trapping air in those alveolar sacs and leading to hyperinflation of the lungs. But it's not productive. So again, hypoventilation, respiratory acidosis, definitely decrease in function. So two different pathways. With emphysema, there is destruction of the alveolar walls, resulting in trapping of air and decreased area for gas exchange, and then this decrease in lung elasticity. This is where we get, they tend to lose a lot of weight because they're using a lot more energy for muscles for breathing. This trapped air causes hyperinflation, and that eventually leads to damaged pulmonary capillaries as the pressure, as that wall disintegrates, the pressure is increased. And so the pressure in the pulmonary capillaries increases, which causes a increase in pressure of the pulmonary artery, and then enlarged right ventricle. Chronic bronchitis is usually more due to inhaled irritants, often pollutants, causes chronic excessive mucus, which then also impairs ventilation and gas exchange. COPD symptoms and treatment, patients can be defined as pink puffers or blue bloaters. Pink puffers are expending a tremendous amount of energy in order to keep up a respiratory rate to maintain normal blood gases. Blue bloaters are not able to keep up that respiratory rate for one reason or another, and so their skin color takes on a bluish hue due to poor oxygenation. Treatment, bronchodilators, corticosteroids. Oxygen has to be monitored because this can actually have negative side effects if too high and too much. Sometimes surgery. For asthma, it's classified as an obstructive pulmonary disorder, but the episodes are acute, not chronic, with symptom-free periods. again, coughing, wheezing, chest tightness. It does affect 10% of the American population, so it's a very prevalent disorder, respiratory disorder. The interesting thing about asthma is a lot of research has been done. And so it is fairly well known to be really an immune disease now. So active inflammation of the airways always precedes bronchospasms. So there's an overactive immune response that is from a subset of the lymphocyte population, and it overproduces IgE and interleukins, and it causes this inflammation. Now, we don't know why these cells go awry, but we do know that they are actively involved, and they always precede asthma becoming symptomatic. So this inflammation occurs before an asthmatic episode, and it's usually there at some level, even if somebody is symptom-free. And that has led to the treatment using corticosteroids as that long-term control, and then bronchodilators for acute episodes. Another disease of the lungs, the respiratory system, is tuberculosis. This is actually what I studied before I came to Ohio. So when I was in Texas, my focus of study was on total drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis. And most of our samples came from South America because 1/3 of the world's population is infected. But most never develop active tuberculosis because our immune system attacks it very strongly and rigorously and isolates it to different parts of the lung to prevent it from spreading and becoming symptomatic. But in countries where there's poor nutrition or poor sanitation, and the immune system is not, it's just kind of overwhelmed or it's not functioning optimally, then they become more symptomatic. Additionally, the treatment is 12-month course of antibiotics. And now this is a series of antibiotics. You'll do one for 6 months, one for 3, another for 3. And it is difficult in many countries to sustain a 12-month course of antibiotics, either through logistics or through finances. So tuberculosis is actually kind of concerning that it will spread and become more active, because it is definitely becoming more virulent. Anyway, off my soapbox, because it's just something it's one of those things that's near and dear to my heart, like many things. Okay. Lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer deaths in North American men and women. It is 90% of cases can be traced back to smoking, and it does unfortunately have a very high mortality rate. The 5-year survival rate is only 16%, which is very low. The reason why is the lungs receive so much of your blood flow, and their tissues are very thin that they metastasize very quickly. There are 3 common types. You do not need to know for the exam the different types of lung cancer, but they kind of fall into 2 categories. Small cell carcinoma stays in the mediastinum, and these are nodules. The nodules grow quickly and metastasize quickly as well. The other 2 types, which is non-small cell carcinoma, if you've seen enough commercials lately, you'll see that they divide them into. These are still aggressive, but not they're just different. They arise in alveolar cells, bronchial epithelium, and bronchial glands, so more the respiratory tract part of it. Lung cancer treatments, early detection is the key to survival. Maybe possibly surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. New therapies are on the horizon. That ends our lecture for today. Lecture exam 2 is now open, and it will remain open until Sunday night at 10 o'clock. There are 50 questions. You have, I think it's 53 or 54 minutes. There are a couple of extra minutes in there because I do recommend that you bring a calculator with you. Just because, like I said, the numbers aren't that hard, but again, time is always a factor, right, with these exams. So 22 questions on chapter 18, the remainder on chapter 21. Bring a calculator. I would even recommend scratch paper and something else. Okay, also, so like there are 4 questions from today. They're pretty straightforward. I think we've covered those pretty well. In general, my opinion of the exam, and of course it's going to differ for everybody, is that the chapter 18 questions on blood vessels are a little bit more complex. Just the topics are a little more complex. To me, the respiratory system seems more straightforward because we can visualize inhaling and exhaling, and that our cells are consuming oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. So a lot of the respiratory system I find intuitive. So I guess I'm just saying, don't gloss over chapter 18. It was a while ago and think, it was a while ago, I'm good. I would spend some time reviewing those concepts as well.